Evening, everyone. This is Mathew Steele and Negation of P with the Elephant in the Room for NCG. I'm back this week with Gary, who goes by Phony Beetle Maniacs on YouTube, and welcome everyone to the show.
Thanks for having me again. And Gary, how you been? We hadn't talked in a while.
I'm okay, thank you, Negation. How are you two?
Good.
Good. So we're here to discuss. Gary, what specifically would you like to discuss for the show?
I'd like to talk about presuppositionalism as I try and argue it, because I heard your debate with.
Right. We should state at the outset that you have somewhat of a disagreement with the way that it's normally presented, especially on YouTube. Would you like to clarify?
I think that the way that Saitan Brudicate presents it is very dishonestly. I disagree with his methodology, and I think that it's a flawed way to present an argument. I think that it's not really an argument, it's a number of assertions that really don't really add up to much, whereas what I try to argue is much more to discover why somebody holds something and why they specifically hold to a specific sense of truth and how they get to that specific round, and then ask them a couple of questions based upon that to see if they could intermittently question their moral precepts. I mean, it may start off where they'll finish off where they started, but it's about trying to get them to understand that there are things that I have necessary problems with.
All right. So can you give us an example of the difference in epistemology or just your general worldview from what is being presented by the Calvinists who are arguing for presuppositional apologetics right now?
Okay. Well, I'm a
difference of opinion with them.
Okay. I'm a Quaker. I'm a moderate. I believe that we all have illusions and delusions of very kind, and that we have to try and come from a place of mutual acceptance of trying to get past those illusions and delusions when it comes to things. So let's say, for example, the way that I framed the presuppositional question is much more around how did you come to your conclusions, like for example, usually the presuppositional question is usually something along the lines of how could you be wrong about everything you know? And then usually based upon that, it's usually, well, how do you know that when the person answers? It's usually very circular and very scripted. It's either going to annoy the person or it's going to deny all the but about 3 or 4 different responses. And that's not really what presuppositionalism is about. It's about expanding how somebody comes to something and maybe expanding with them how we each justify our own positions.
Okay, so you're just basically suggesting that the apologetic, as you see it, should be used. It needs to be more Socratic.
Well, not just Socratic, but also very. I'd say it's very pre-modernist, but it's probably bordering on modernist because I did learn it when I did modernism. So. Well, postmodernism actually, but and the thing is that it's much more about investing in ideas and how we come to concepts, and much less about trying to distinguish that somebody has to borrow from a worldview in order to hold a point of view.
Negation, you wanted to add?
I mean, other than just to kind of clarify a couple of things, so just to, I guess to kind of get a little bit more clear on the difference between the flavors of presuppositionalism, if you will. Let's say that I made a statement. Keep it simple. 2 + 2 is 4. How would that differ from, let's say I'm making an absolute statement there. I believe that to be true. Absolutely. Now, a psi version of the presuppositionalism at that point would usually go down the path, could you be wrong, and all of that. What would your, I guess, technique be, or what is the more correct usage of that?
I'd say that is an axiomatic truth or a mathematical proof, but I'd say that is not necessarily those words, because let's say, for example, and this is the thing that I usually say is that, let's say, for example, there's people in China. There's people in China. Are you going to say that they use 2 + 2 = 4? No, they're going to use their own language and own mathematical symbols that denote that. But it's going to be totally different from the English system we use, or let's say, I don't know, somebody in I don't know,
Right.
Mesoamerica back in the 14th century, before Spanish came in, they wouldn't really know what a two is.
Well,
Or if you really want to expand it even further, let's say there's alien life out there, which I personally believe there is. They're not going to know what 2 + 2 equals either, because to them, that's an that's from a language they don't speak, and that's the
right,
whole point.
but that's more of a linguistic problem. As far as a conceptual problem, I would assume that you'd agree that all of those different races, including the alien race, would have a concept of what we call 2 + 2 = 4, and on that level, we could connect by doing more of a demonstration of, just having four apples there and putting two together and then making the plus sign, put them together, and then and then count out four. I mean, we could get there even if our linguistics don't match. But I guess the question that I was trying to get at is that being able to use reason, logic, mathematical axioms to state what I would consider truths um, is, I guess, problematic for the psi version of presuppositionalism, because they say that the only way that we can know that to be true is through God. And I guess the question that I was trying to get to is that kind of the same thing that yours boils down to, or is there a different approach that um, uh, the I guess in your opinion the real presuppositional approach should be?
Uh, well, things like that, things like axiomatic truths, don't necessarily, because 2 + 2 = 4 is a mathematical proof. And mathematical proofs uh, go outside what we consider to be our own reality-based brains. So it's not necessarily something that we hold as concepts. It's something that operates outside that.
Okay. Um, but okay, well let's change it. And instead of saying using a mathematical proof, because I mean we both agree there that it does. Um, oh, well, I won't get into that deal. Let's say something that oh, the world exists. I believe the world exists, and I'm going to act accordingly.
Okay.
Um, Now, to a psi version, what they're going to say is at that point you can't believe that because you have no basis for that truth. You have no accountability for your reason and logic, or you haven't accounted for the reason and logic that has allowed you to deduce that as a objective truth. Um, is there any difference between how they would branch off there and try to basically demonstrate that I have no foundation for that belief, or would it be? I mean, I'm not understanding what the real difference between the versions of presuppositionalism is.
Okay, well, I'm a evidentially presuppositionalist, so
Okay.
I would argue that you probably can guess that the world exists because you know one thing for absolute certain, which is that you know that you exist. You may exist not in the form that you currently think you exist, which your negation of P, you live wherever you live, but you exist in some sort of form, and you can make predictions and assumptions based upon that you exist in that form as a corporeal being that is known on the internet as negation of P.
Okay.
That is a presumption. Now, I doubt, and again, because I think that those sort of questions of, well, how do you know that, don't really work out here, because again, our existence and how we base our assumptions are based upon reality, are based upon the same sort of evidences. It's when we differ that I think that the question gets more prudent. Let's say on morals, let's say on, for example, metaphysical truths. That's when presuppositionalism is important. It's not important in, let's say, for example, real world dissociated facts, because we're both basing it upon what we are assuming our senses and our reasoning and our logic is telling us, that the world is a sphere which is what 80% water and 30% land, and has an atmosphere which is which is oxygen and a lot of other stuff that we presume we conclude from based upon everything we can taste, see, and smell to be true. Again, the thing is that the Science 10 version of things that you can't make those assumptions because you've got nothing to base it upon, which I disagree with.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, man. That definitely clears things up for me. I didn't want to sidetrack this, so Matthew, why don't you take us back to what y'all actually came to talk about? Sorry about
Well,
that.
honestly, I wanted to bring Gary on because he has such a definite, very thoughtful approach to this discussion. Presuppositional apologetics have gotten such a bad rap lately that we forget that there are some very serious issues tied up in these topics of discussion. It's not just a gotcha argument that people have turned the pop understanding of it into. It has to do with epistemology at its core. How do we know what we know? What can we know about theology? This sort of thing. So I was having a discussion with Gary. What was it, about a week ago, in the after show of a hangout between Alex Botten and Jason Peterson. We were discussing these issues in the after show, and we thought that there was a lot more to cover. So I realized that presuppositional apologetics are something of a dead horse, the way that they're usually talked about. But the issues of theology and epistemology and basically how we account for our knowledge, those are important things to discuss. And even if you have 100% justification, no doubt whatsoever that there are things that you know for certain, then you should still be willing to be skeptical of what you think you know. Even if the answer is going to turn out to be yes, you still should be able to ask yourself the question, am I right? Am I wrong? And I think that's why we need to talk about these things. Because when it comes to the supernatural, when it comes to the limits of our knowledge, the limits of what we're able to rationally discern, we need to be honest about what we can and can't know up to those limits and not beyond them, unless there is something like revelation posited, and then we need to discuss that to see if that's accessible by everyone or in specific means. I think that's where the real meat of the discussion is. So, Gary, you have, in my experience, you have a more Socratic approach of asking, as you said, can you explain to me how you arrived at your conclusions about knowledge, about how you see the world? So could you just basically lay out why you are a proponent of presuppositional apologetics from the direction that you're coming from? And let's try to move away from the more popularized version of it and talk about what you think and what you believe and why you argue for those. All
Okay.
right?
I argue for evidential apology. Presuppositionalism for a couple of reasons. Two of them is that I studied in uni, and I found it very interesting method of trying to get to a knowledge basis. And the second method is that I myself have to test what I experience, and am I operating under some sort of delusion because of my personal mental makeup, because I suffer from developmental dyspraxia. That has a very high rate of mental illness. Now, I don't think I'm currently suffering from any sort of mental incurrence there, but I think that um, but I have to make sure that I'm not. And because of that, that's one of the reasons that I do hold to evidentiary presuppositionalism. That I think that I should be able to test what I think and why do I think it. And I think that everybody should be able to do that, because I think that we do make presuppositions based upon the evidence we see around us. Now, are they the correct presuppositions? I want to test why you think certain things. Now, there are certain individuals who I think uh, say that they absolutely know something, but they absolutely don't. And I think that they're the sort of people that would probably have the most problem with my approach, because what I do is that I say that is a presupposition by me and obviously you, because you presupposed your own conclusions. You said that the evidence points a certain way, and I'm going to go where the evidence leads me. But you're presupposing that the evidence works in a certain method you think it does, and I don't believe it does. I think that we're all making massive assumptions about the way we think that the evidence is leading us. I mean, but we all have presumed evidences of why we think that. That makes sense. So do you want me to expand further?
Okay, so where would you say the um, first of all, this is a question that I usually ask any presuppositional apologist is, do you consider the biblical God the only possible justification for knowledge? And if so, is that something that is that a conclusion that we can arrive at rationally? And I usually
Uh,
get the answer no, that you can't. There's always going to be faith involved somehow, even if it's just placing God as the source of rationality in an axiomatic fashion to their worldview. So I'm wondering how you would answer that.
I'd answer that with I think you can rise at knowledge and things like that, because again you are having to test things based upon what you currently are witnessing and experiencing. However, is that what you're witnessing and experiencing true, or is it a representation of truth? Because there's other people who experience other things. And is that true? I think that we all have to base. I think the problem is that presuppositionalists think that God is the only justification thing. And again, I don't believe in the quote unquote biblical God, because I think that is a very narrow way of looking at it. I believe, again, I'm a Christian deist in that I believe in a deist God, but I'll believe in the teachings of quote unquote Christ. But the only way I can arrive at God is to know that my own mental processes to get there are based upon my own reason logic, which can be flawed. And I think that if more people could what's the word, justify that and understand that, then we could all have more fruitful discussions, I think.
All right, I completely agree that arriving at the conclusion early in life, before you've even really established any sort of formal worldview that you can use to make predictions and learn on your own. So as a child, you realize that you can make mistakes. Every child realizes this, and to make the leap that then there are some beliefs that you cannot be wrong about, that takes, in my opinion, takes rational justification. And to set a conclusion in your mind that is not evaluated rationally, but you're still asserting that it's true, that I think is where I have the biggest problem with presuppositional apologetics. So it's really reassuring to me to hear that you don't do that. You allow that you could be wrong, and it's not so much, I think, that we're incapable of having certainty about some knowledge. It's that you come to the conclusion, not you specifically, but you, general, come to the conclusion that you don't have to analyze a belief. You don't have to question it. It is above questioning. And since we are fallible, we have to always be willing to ask, am I wrong? Even if the answer is going to be yes 100% of the time. To not be willing to ask yourself that, I think, is to undercut the value of the best tool that we have for evaluating the world around us. So, if you could talk a little bit more about how you arrive at the conclusion of the way that you identify what the word God means to you, and why you think that's the best explanation.
Uh, well, as an atheist until I was I'd say about 18, 19. And then I just fell away from it. I was quote unquote an agnostic, in that religion didn't really have any sort of sway for me, and I wasn't an atheist. I was an agnostic. If atheist and theist to me had no truck in my life, so it didn't really bother me. And then like one day, it was like sort of like a moment where I just thought, you know what, I'm going to research this for myself and I'm going to come to my own conclusion about it. So that's what I did. I went to the library and I got science books and theology books and I started to read. And the theist side, made more sense to me than the no God side. The fact that the evidence, as I saw it and I interpreted it, seemed to point to a deity in them rather than not. Now, I could be wrong about that, and that everything I'm interpreting incorrectly, because I have to understand that reasoning could be faulty. I could be misreading or misinterpreting things, because I admit freely right now I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to be a scientist. My degree's not in science at all. It's in English. But I think that I have quite a reasonable approach to science and reason and philosophy, theology, that I can get to a reasonable truth from my own point of view. Now, you might disagree with that, my interpretation of things, but it doesn't mean that those interpretations are wrong necessarily. Uh, but again, you could look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. The reason that I adopt presuppositionalism is that I have to acknowledge that my own faulty reasoning can be faulted, and then I have to understand that your reasoning can be faulted, and how do we get to something that's maybe closer to the quote unquote truth based upon that.
Okay, can you, within your epistemology, within your understanding of the world, can you explain what truth means and
Okay.
how you arrive at a true conclusion?
Uh, I would. Okay, on. I would say a truth conclusion can be drawn from many different sources. It can be drawn from evidentialism. It can be drawn from physics. It can be drawn from philosophy. It can be drawn from theology. Um, okay, so negation, because Matt seems
Yeah,
to have.
I just got that. Sorry, I just got that notification. I think what Matthew was trying to get at, I may be off here too as well. But the other, I guess, facet that he asked you about, and if you could kind of expand on this, and this to me is the most interesting part, in the way that I guess from when we've interacted and whatever, is kind of what not only what sources you're drawing your truth from and what it means to you, but also what truths have led you to believe that there is a deity, rather than not being one, or enough to where I guess the question is take enough to where you could make the step over from a agnostic to yes, I do now believe there is a God. What have you seen that's moved you to that direction?
Okay. When I looked at, for example, the multiverse theory as proposed by like people like Richard, I looked at, like, for example, physics and the multiverse theory, and that made me more. That's persuaded me that there was something behind what we consider creation, because there's something that started off the chain that led to the multiverse theory, in my opinion. Um, but if you want a source of truth, I mean, do you mean moral truths? Because I mean, for the moral truths, I'd say it's probably the Bible and some other works. Like, for example, I'm a big fan of like uh, I'm not going to say Noam Chomsky, but I'm a big fan of socialist works. Like, for example, I'm a big fan of like Gandhi's and Martin Luther King's social policies and stuff like that. So it depends what you mean. I mean, like, because there's different facets of my beliefs that are
No,
based upon different things.
sorry, I lost my connection there. That's why I fell out.
Sorry, Robert.
I wanted to know specifically, and you may have answered this while I was trying to reconnect, but I wanted to know specifically how you think someone can arrive at a true conclusion about reality. How
Uh,
process how you would reach that conclusion, if you could
uh,
describe it.
the honest answer is I don't know, because because there's multiple tools that one could use to it, like evidentialism, philosophy, a combination of the two pure science. But again, if you talk about truth with the lower T or capital T, because those are two different things.
Okay, I'm glad to hear you say that. The way that I define my from my own worldview, the way I define knowledge is a belief that you are justified by reason, logic, and evidence to consider true, as in best fitting the reality that you have available to you. That doesn't mean that you are in possession of absolute truth. It just means that you're justified in every way that you can be to consider something absolutely true. Now, that may mean that there is a deficit of evidence. That may mean that you have lots of evidence but no rational basis for saying, or very little rational basis for saying something is true, but it's so evident that it can't really be denied, like the physical world existing. I presuppose the physical world exists based on the massive amount of evidence and experience that truth. So I don't think that there is a rational basis for saying the physical world absolutely exists, and I can be 1,000% certain of that. It's just it has to be that way. So I don't think that you can escape the limitations of human rationality, the flaws in our our the way we see the world. There's always going to be those flaws there, and yet you can still arrive at a completely true conclusion. So that's what I was basically asking from you: is how
Oh,
do you
okay.
make that discernment, and if you agree with what I'm saying.
I agree to somewhat a degree because I think that there's numerous ways to get to a truth. Like for example, if you use philosophy to get to a truth, but empiricism disagreed. Which one's superior? I mean, and why? And that's an honestly pretty question. I mean, do you use both? Do you use either? I mean, I personally think that a more rounded worldview is one that uses both to come to a clearer conclusion because I think philosophy and science go hand in hand, but I'm just one of those pragmatic types that seems to think that. But there's some people who seem to believe in this pure empiricistic point of view. There's some people who believe in the pure philosophical point of view. So, again, if you ask those people, they'd probably say that their truth comes from their particular one those they strive towards. I personally believe that truth comes from a combination of the two. But if you're talking about absolute truth with a capital T, I don't believe that absolute truths, apart from that we exist. But that's just my opinion.
As far as what we can know, not that they don't exist, but just that we can't necessarily know them to be 100 or 1,000, as I always say,
Yeah,
percent certainty, right?
yeah.
Okay, so
I mean, because we could always have that margin of error, and we're all flawed human beings, and we could all make mistakes and miscalculations and misappropriations. We have to know that. But I think that the problem is that too many people assert things that they don't have real knowledge of. And that's why that's why the reason I use presuppositionalism is to get to explain to me how they can be certain of things that I'm not certain of, but I know there are presuppositions on my behalf because of what I know and educated on, but I fully admit that I could be flawed on.
all right, well, that's good to hear, because I consider that the first step towards wisdom, to admit the limitations of what you know and what you can know. Um, to me, there are so many philosophical and scientific fields out there that the more you end up looking into them, the more well versed you become in um, the history of philosophy, or what this philosopher said, what that philosopher said, or in a scientific discipline. Uh, uh, the amount of time that you end up investing in a field, and your confidence in being able to arrive at true conclusions in that field, whether it's science or philosophy, or not necessarily that those two are completely separate from each other, but um, I think that there's a real problem with pigeonholing the discussion into one or the other. Like if you start talking about philosophy, to say that oh well you're going in a naturalistic direction, philosophically speaking, because you're relying so heavily on the scientific method, that means that you therefore must believe that supernatural is not true and you're taking a hard naturalistic stance, when that's not necessarily what someone is doing at all. And just because you're using an evidential argument doesn't mean that you are, say, an empiricist. It just means that that is the explanation for reality that makes the most sense in that context. And as you said, and I completely agree, that the more methods, the more tools that you have available to you to arrive at a conclusion, and the more ways that your assertion and your conclusion are justified by those tools, whether it's science or philosophy or intuition, whatever it might be, you are more justified to consider something true the more tools you use to arrive at that conclusion. If you're just simply saying this is true and that's all there is to it, just because I need that so that the rest of my worldview will make sense, I think that that is a mistake, and it's a misuse of rationality to support a bias. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay. I'm sorry, we're talking all over negation. Negation, do you have anything you want to add?
Don't worry about it, man. I'm having fun listening. So y'all are definitely talking right up my alley. I like these kind of conversations. So don't worry about talking over me or anything else, because I just want to be listening lately. But and now I just lost my train of thought, of course. So I was going to ask Gary something. Go ahead, and I'll come back to it.
I'll kick it over to Gary in just a second. I just want to say that people are probably sick of hearing about presuppositional apologetics, and it shouldn't be that way, because, as Negation is saying, this is a fascinating discussion to have. It's not just a first world problems kind of discussion where we don't have nothing better to do than sit around and discuss this. No, it's figuring out what about reality makes the most sense, how you're able to arrive at a better conclusion than you may have realized you could have about what is and isn't true, and being willing to admit that you have limitations and try to overcome them if possible. These are all very important topics to discuss. And I think that's what people end up missing about the presuppositional apologetic, is that it's being pigeonholed in a way that is not conducive to actually having the discussion. And I think that is why we're here doing this now.
And the other thing that's valuable that gets really washed away a lot, at least in my opinion, is the fact that we all have presuppositions and we base our actions on those presuppositions. And like you were saying earlier, Matthew, if you can't test those presuppositions, like Gary was saying, that there may be a time where your mental capacity, your mental faculties are not working in a way that would make those presuppositions accurate. So unless you're willing to test those, you can really get into a world of hurt, to the point where you're doing some things that could either be harmful to yourself or others. So when we have someone like Gary come on that says, look, I fully acknowledge I have presuppositions about this and I want to test them, to me, that's the most valuable thing that I think both sides need to embrace.
Okay, but the thing is that the other thing about presuppositionalism is discussing moral points, because I think the point is that the discussion I usually hear from most non-believers is that, well, the society I am influences the moral outlook I have, which I find to be problematic. Well, I don't find to be. I actually find it to be extremely problematic, because the society you're in could decide one day that it wants to be things that don't necessarily you agree with, and things like that. So that's one of the problems I have. I think presuppositionalism gets to is why do you necessarily agree with the society you're in? Why does somebody else's society, which may have a different moral view, is inferior to that?
Well,
is it because you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly.
Is it because you're born in it? Is it because you personally you're because you're brought up in it? That's the one you agree with. What about somebody who's brought up in China, where they torture kids and they do, and they have people working in sweatshops for like 2 cents? Are they morally inferior to you because you work in the United States where you don't do that and they have kids having a full-time education?
Right, and that's the valuable point that I was talking about, is that to first acknowledge that, a lot of your values, a lot of your truths, small t truths, you've come by because of your upbringing, because the societal norms. And once you understand that and you start to, like what you're saying, question that and go, now wait a second, why is yours necessarily better? And if you can't define it as necessarily better, then it might not be. That's what I'm saying is where the discussion gets really interesting, is when we get down to those truths, again, small t, and say, are these really the right way to go or not?
I
Okay.
think that the way that the topic that you brought up here, Gary, and how you determine your morality based on society, it's a more complex issue, I think, than that. I think it's that people are not most of the time willing to say or even consider that their morality is better than the entire society's. They might not consider their own ideas to be better than everyone else's. Sometimes people do, and sometimes they're right. But most of the time, you are reacting reflexively in your understanding of the world based on what's happening around you. And if there are a lot of murders happening around you, you're going to be focusing more on how much of a problem murder is. If there is a lot of muggings going on, people are having their wallets stolen, then you're going to be more focused on fixing that part of society, and trying to reduce how often it's occurring. But I think for the most part, it's sort of like I take a very evolutionary approach to the function of how life continues, in that it's acted upon by the environment. And the pressure that it's put under, depending on its resilience, or depending on its capability, the life, whatever form it's taking, is going to either crack under the strain and go extinct, or it's going to adapt. And for a society that's strong in its ability to survive, that also has to do with both self-preservation and passing on those characteristics to the rest of society. And we do that through communication. We do that through forming a conscious consensus of what is and is not moral. And that's really the hot topic in all of society, in Western society, especially right now. I mean, I'm not, can't really speak about what's going on in China or India or anywhere else aside from, I live in Canada and I grew up in the U.S., so it's very prevalent to me here. Issues like gun control, healthcare, petty crime, and the banks that perpetrated the economic collapse in 2008. All of these things are what are shaping our understanding of what is and is not moral, and how we should treat other people, because you're being acted upon, and in a reflexive manner you're deciding then how you're best to respond. It's not like we're coming into the discussion with a fully formed set of morality, a set of morals. In my opinion, anyway, we're not coming into it with that. We are deciding on what the influences around us, how we're going to make the world a better place, considering the environment that we're in.
Okay. But I would say that as a Christian myself, that I do have moral precepts. Like I have to be moral precepts given me to by Christ, and I think that necessarily me and non-believers would agree that there are things that we need to sort out together. Like for example, with your crime example, the fact is that there'd be less crime if there was less poverty in the West, in the world, whatever you want to call it, in your local area, because the reason people steal anything is because they don't have enough money or disposable income to buy whatever it is they're to feed. So the way to fix that is to amend the social inequality that happens there. And I think that's something that maybe non-believers and believers can agree with. How they get to that can be discussed later, but those are things that I think that non-believers and believers would agree on.
Yes, the problem comes though. I agree with what you're saying. The problem comes though when in a society that's growing such a vast and powerful communication system, where you're able to talk to, I'm speaking to you and you're in the United Kingdom right now. I'm in Canada, negation's in the U.S. We're still having this conversation though, something that wouldn't really have been popular or possible 30 or 40 years ago. So our ability to discuss these issues on an intellectual level has been enhanced by the communication network that we've set up. So we're able to, in that way, have a relevant discussion on the problems in our society, um, focusing more on the issue and how to fix it, if possible, than talking about what's happening in our personal lives, what's happening in our neighborhood or in our cities, where we're looking at the world, how it's affecting the world, and in that way trying to work together to make a more functional a moral system for everyone, to include how we take care of our poor, and how to make sure that the 1% are not just basically robbing everyone blind. And this, I think, is the real benefit of the higher functions that we have over the other species, is our ability to do this. Now, does that mean that we are more morally intrinsically good, or that we're better off than those other animals? I don't know. It's again, it's a matter of the environment reacting to, or us reacting to our environment. So right now we're reacting to each other, and we're also reacting to what we're learning through this communication system. So I very much believe that we are forming our morality as we go along based on what we've already learned, in the same way that we build any understanding of the world. Our moral
Okay.
moral outlook is just a part of that.
Okay. I mean, I disagree, but and here's why. I think that what we morally think is good and bad is set forth by numerous factors that we accept. Like, for example, we accept things like, for example, murder and robbery and things like that are bad. How we come to that is obviously the point of tension with a lot of people. For me, it isn't. The fact that we agree on that is something that we should all celebrate, in my opinion. But the problem is that the moral precepts we have now are still the same as we had about 100, 200 years ago, because when you look at, for example, the industrial age. Let's use that as a example, because I live in an industrial city, or former one in a way, and the way that things are now. Not a lot has changed. There's still inequality of wealth. There's still a lot of people who are living in poverty, and there's still people who are not getting the education they should be, because the system is not really set up to help those people out. It's set up to give people education on a flat level and not treat people as individuals, which is the way that education really should work, because not everybody's going to learn at the same level, the same approach is going to work for them, in my opinion.
I agree, and we always have the problem of empathy, which is I would argue, our emotional disposition about what happens to us and to others, that we're aware of. But there's still some intention to it as well. There's conscious choice on how to make our system of society better, based on what we've seen, to make an intellectually informed, um, sort of objective decision on what's best for society instead of just for ourselves. So I think that it's both. It's not just our experience and our emotions, how they're tied up in what happens to us and what happens to other people, but what's best for society as a whole. And that's where these intellectual issues of theology and such come in. I think that that's why this discussion is so important. And unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the show. So I realized I've done most of the talking for this show, and I want to pass it over to Negation. Negation, you can and handle the rest.
Well, I just had, hopefully, it's definitely not a quick question, but I wanted to get it out there just so I kind of understood Gary a little bit better. Gary, do you think there's a danger in, let's say, the secular belief system, in that it would potentially erode morals, or lead us to a place that is, I guess, less ethical than a religious, specifically the Christian point of view?
Uh, if I was to answer that honestly, in a way yes, but in a way no, because again, it depends on what sort of ethical system you're working upon. If it's something that's Christian influenced, then it's going to be a social progress. If it's Christian denied, then I do have a worry for that, because whenever that's happened, we've had trouble. But I think that a good secular system, for me, ethical system, would be one that draws upon different sources. Let's say, for example, the Hindu source or a Buddhist source and stuff like that, and incorporates all of them to create more of a more developed society. Because again, I think that one of the things I like about the US so much is that it is a secular, well, it's supposed to be a secular country, and it is based upon secular ethics. And because I mean, I don't want to live in a theocracy. Even though I do live in a theocracy, I don't want to live in a proper theocracy, because trust me, I'd be first against the wall. I think that's the problem, is that whenever it's one particular quote unquote mindset that takes over, then they tend to lord that power over people who don't agree with that mindset, and that's probably the biggest problem I would have, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I
Is
thought.
that is that it's the old adage, isn't it? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, it's okay saying, "Oh, well, I think that X is better than Y, and X morality is better than Y." Well, no, it's everything together, making a better society. But the thing is that you got to keep it on control. Otherwise, you're going to have people being persecuted because they don't agree with that mindset. You should have people who are free to disagree with your current ethical framework.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely a long rabbit hole, and I'd love to do that sometime. And if you'd like to come back, I know we would both love to have you, and if nothing else, explore that facet of it. So, but I think that we're running out of time. Again, thanks for coming, and thanks everybody for watching. Mathew, I'll turn it back over to you. Let you close it out.
All right, Gary, there's obviously a lot more to talk about on this. So we'd like to have you back sometime soon. I'm not sure when, but I think just the moral discussion is a whole show in and of itself. So if you're, interested in that, then I'm sure we'd both love to have you back.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Negation, and thank you, everyone. This is Mathew Steele with the Elephant in the Room and the NGC, and we'll be back next week on Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central. Thank you.
Good night, all.